Welcome to this webinar introducing the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition methodology for deforestation and conversion-free pulp, paper, and fiber-based packaging. Brought to you by the Forest Positive Coalition with support from ProForest. The objectives of this webinar are for key users to learn about the Coalition's deforestation conversion-free sorting methodology for pulp, paper, and fiber-based packaging, also known as PPP, and also to improve key users' ability to support member reporting on DCF. Begin with some brief background of the Forest Positive Coalition commitments, action, and accountability before a deep dive into the DCF methodologies. The Forest Positive Coalition is composed of 22 leading manufacturers and retailers committed to driving collective transformative change to remove deforestation, forest conversion, and degradation from key commodity supply chains. In this work, the Coalition is supported by the Tropical Forest Alliance and ProForest. To deliver this forest positive ambition, the Coalition has a three-pronged approach across own sourced volumes, working with suppliers, and addressing systemic issues in production landscapes through collaborative approaches. These actions are underpinned by transparency and accountability. The theory of change is operationalized by roadmaps for the 4 Coalition commodities, which are cattle-derived products, palm oil, soy, and pulp, paper, and fiber-based packaging. These roadmaps each have 5 elements of the forest positive approach, which are managing own supply chains, working with suppliers, monitoring the production base, engaging in production landscapes, and transparency and accountability. For each of these 5 elements, the roadmap specifies individual member and collective company commitments, actions, and KPIs on which the Coalition companies publicly report on an annual basis. To support the implementation of the roadmaps, the Coalition has published a series of resources, which include roadmap implementation guidance, guidance for suppliers who would like to know more about how to become forest positive businesses, and also a palm oil monitoring and response framework. These are all readily available on the Consumer Goods Forum website. Next, we'll deep dive into the 2 roadmap elements most linked to the topic of this webinar, which is deforestation and conversion-free methodologies. Element 1 of each of the 4 commodity roadmaps covers members' own supply chain and volume sourcing, which includes a commitment to be deforestation and conversion-free across commodity business. For this commitment, there's a corresponding KPI to track progress to DCF using an aligned methodology and understanding of commodity scope. This KPI is reported on each year by member companies through the Coalition's annual report. DCF for own volumes is not enough for sectoral transformation. Therefore, element 2 of each roadmap covers expectations for member suppliers to be forest positive across the supplier's commodity business, not just for volume sourced by the Coalition companies. Through the roadmaps, the companies are committed to communicating and implementing the forest positive approach with suppliers, including through collaboration to address shared sectoral challenges. As with element 1, there's also a KPI for members to report on this supplier engagement. Next, we will understand the cross-commodity DCF methodology, which forms the basis for each of the commodity-specific methodologies.
Talking about how this was developed and also some of the underlying principles. So first, to note, the methodology was developed with the Coalition, but also in consultation with key partners. This includes the Accountability Framework Initiative, CDP, and also TRACE. One of the core principles in the development of the methodology was in achieving alignment and an aligned approach to DCF that allows companies to report in a way that is both consistent but also credible across the Coalition, but also with the wider sector. And the intention is that by socializing the methodology, there is wider uptake of this methodology kind of beyond the Coalition across the sector too. It's also important to note that there is a commitment to transparency in the Coalition, including reporting on DCF, And the intention is that coalition suppliers are also able to uptake these same principles in terms of public reporting and transparency. So moving on to the basic principles of the generic DCF methodology. First, we're going to talk through the key steps that build up the methodology and the several different implementation options and what this means for different kinds of businesses. So first, we have these three key steps within the methodology. The first being able to trace back to a production unit at a scale needed to confirm the status. So this depends on the context that we're talking about. And we'll talk about those commodity-specific components as we go through the methodology. Secondly, confirming that there's been no deforestation after the cutoff date. And finally, being able to monitor the remaining vegetation and also effectively respond to any new deforestation or conversion in the future. So there's several different ways of implementing those three steps through different implementation options, which we'll now walk through. So the first implementation option A, is through certification under an acceptable scheme and chain of custody. Within certification, this includes those three steps that we just walked through. So there's a stage at which there's traceability, there's a certifier on the ground who can verify where the volumes came from. There's then also these stages of monitoring and checking that information. Implementation option B includes area level monitoring. This has also been referred to as negligible risk in the sector, though generally the sectoral aligned language that we use is area level monitoring. This relates to geographic areas at different scales depending on the commodity context, where there is little to no deforestation or conversion. And so a specific geographic area can be considered negligible risk or minimal risk. Implementation option C includes remote monitoring. So this might be through remote monitoring platforms where you have traceability and you can check that there's been no deforestation or conversion in that area. And finally, as opposed to remote monitoring, this could also be done through an on-the-ground field assessment. It's important to note out that these different implementation options may be more or less used depending on the commodity context, and that's something that we will be going through as you go through the material. These implementation options are most relevant for upstream companies or companies where there's good access to robust traceability information. In a context where there's limited traceability information to a production area, a company, particularly those further downstream, might be more reliant on their suppliers in being able to access this information about the deforestation and conversion-free status of their volumes. In that case, we might talk about implementation options E. So this is where you check that your supplier has an effective DCF control mechanism. And all that really means is that you're ensuring that your supplier is implementing a combination of A, B, C, or D that is effectively addressing deforestation and conversion and the risks associated with that in the supply chain. So we're now going to be walking through the commodity-specific interpretations of this generic methodology. These have been adapted for each of the 4 forest-positive coalition commodities: palm oil, soy, pulp paper and fibre-based packaging, and cattle-derived products. And all of these methodologies build off the fundamental principles which have been presented in that generic DCF methodology. Forest-positive coalition DCF methodology for pulp, paper and fibre-based packaging. So it's important to note that, as with the other commodities, the pulp and paper DCF methodology is strongly built on the generic DCF methodology, which has been presented. So you can see, as we go through the methodology, that all of the different steps include these 3 stages of tracing back to production unit, confirming no deforestation after the cutoff date, and also monitoring remaining natural vegetation. We'll also be talking through the different implementation options in the context of pulp and paper, and also considering which are more relevant in this commodity-specific context. So first, we'll talk through the traceability expectations in the context of PPP. As you will have seen within the generic DCF methodology, tracing back to production area at a scale needed is one of the first steps within each of the DCF implementation options. And traceability is really important in understanding and addressing risks. However, it can be resource intensive to build these systems. And so it's really important that companies are collecting information at a level of granularity that allows them to effectively manage and mitigate risk. In the context of the PPP sector, it's a norm to be able to achieve at least traceability to country of harvest, so where the forest first came from, and then being able to achieve more granular information such as subnational level or forest unit level might be important to be able to manage risks, but also is quite challenging, particularly in the context of packaging, where there are several intermediaries in the supply chain. It's also important to note that in the context of PPP, pulp and pulp sources, so including chips or timber waste, also can travel quite significant distances. And that adds an additional complexity because a mill might be sourcing fibre from a forest that is a significant distance away from the mill. Finally, it's important to note that in the context of pulp and paper in the sector, there is a very strong emphasis on certification and certified volumes. However, there are many certification schemes where it's not automatic to pass on traceability information to the end buyer, and this can contribute to challenges in accessing traceability information. However, it's important that companies are working towards achieving more granular traceability information in contexts where there's higher priority or risk levels. In the context of accessing traceability information or understanding a supplier's system, a forest positive coalition member or a buyer may collect this information through a self-reporting form or a traceability template that they send out as part of an annual process of engaging with suppliers and collecting information regarding the volumes that have been sold from the supplier to the buyer. The type of information that might be included within that form includes the scope of traceability data that's included, the kind of products that the supplier is selling to the buyer, the percentage of the volumes that are recycled as opposed to virgin fibre, and then the certification claim, so the scheme that's being used and also the percent that's certified, alongside traceability information, which might include country of harvest, but might also include information on the pulp mill or even some national data. It's also important to note that not all suppliers might kind of segregate their reporting per buyer. In that case, the supplier might report the full list of the fibre that they source associated with a volume-based ratio. And as we go through this webinar, you'll see between each implementation option, we'll talk about the kind of information an FBC company buyer might be requesting from their supplier. However, a lot of this information is likely to have come through a self-reporting form that a buyer requested that a supplier was to complete. We also want to include a couple notes regarding recycled fibre. So within the Forest Positive Coalition's PPP roadmap, it's important to note that it doesn't focus on recycled fibre. It's generally focused on virgin fibre. However, recycled material is acknowledged as important, and so coalition members do publicly report on the percentage of their PPP that's from recycled or alternative fibres. This is acknowledged acknowledged through the opportunity that recycled fibre offers through increased efficiency, as well as the importance of reducing and reusing packaging. And under the coalition, recycled fibre is already considered to be DCF. However, companies may be collecting information on recycled fibre and may have some checks in place associated with these volumes, and that kind of information is likely to be collected through one of these self-reporting forms that a supplier might be completing. Before we run through the different implementation options, we have a flow here which demonstrates the kinds of ways that a company might be breaking down their volumes. So first, we start with the full scope of volumes at the top. As noted, recycled material is deemed to be DCF. Moving on then to the virgin fibre, we will work through these certification schemes, but there's certified FSC content, and that can be considered deforestation free for both FSC 100% and FSC mix. For PEFC content, there are some additional steps that may need to be in place, or additional control systems. The same is true for SFI certified content. We can then move down to the low priority country box, and volumes that are from low priority countries for PPP driven deforestation can be considered deforestation free. For volumes that don't fit within any of these categories above, or volumes where some additional control systems might need to be in place, this is where a FBC buyer may trace to a more granular production area beyond country of harvest to be able to get to a point at which they can define deforestation free since the cutoff date. So this may include remote or field assessment and monitoring, or confirmation that a supplier is effectively implementing their DCF system. So this relates to implementation option E, where a FPC buyer confirms that a supplier has an effective combination of A, B, C, or D in place. For volumes that aren't yet DCF, there's many different actions that a company might take to address these volumes, including improving their traceability and monitoring system, developing roadmaps with suppliers to support movement towards DCF compliance, engagement with certification schemes, and also engagement in landscape initiatives. It's important to note also that the coalition made a decision that conversion of non-forest ecosystems and degradation are important to consider within the DCF methodology. However, until 2025, the primary focus of the coalition is on delivering deforestation free, whilst working to understand how to report and monitor effectively on conversion and degradation to fully include these components by 2030. And so post 2025, one of the key components is to build this full inclusion, either be through certification scheme engagement and the kinds of criteria that they have, or other supportive mechanisms that can be put in place. We're now going to work through the different implementation options in the context of PPP. So first, certification is one of the most frequently used tools in the context of PPP, both on delivering for DCF, but also on wider sustainability commitments. Adequate certification schemes can be considered DCF, considering key components like aligned cutoff dates, deforestation, degradation, and conversion definitions, and also adequate chain of custody schemes. It's important that the material is able to be traced back to the certified forest site, and that if there is mixing, that there's effective controls in place so that we can assure that the non-certified material that's mixed in is also deforestation and conversion free. It's important to note that there's been a lot of progress made in the pulp and paper sector towards forest certification. However, there are still areas where engagement beyond certification is important. For example, where there may be underlying governance issues or in supporting actions in priority areas where there's still risk of supply from controversial sources. And in some cases, certification alone may not yet be able to effectively mitigate those risks. So first, considering Forest Stewardship Council, both mixed and 100% certified forest material can be considered deforestation free because of the effective control systems that are in place for the uncertified material that gets mixed in with the certified content. Then for PEFC and SFI, alone, these currently don't yet fulfill DCF criteria. However, they are key schemes in contributing to mitigating against deforestation. And it's important to note that these schemes, volumes from these schemes can be complemented with other actions falling under implementation option E regarding a supply control system, which we will discuss further. So the kind of information that a forest positive coalition company buyer might request from a supplier. First, they may be looking at the certification claim on the invoice, which would state both the chain of custody type, scheme, and the percentage certified, as well as the supplier certificate number. And this is likely to, again, be gathered through the self-reporting or traceability data collection exercise, where a supplier would fill out the information on the percentage of volumes that are certified by each scheme. Then moving on to area level monitoring. So in this context, we're talking about geographic areas with little to no risk of deforestation and conversion. In the context of PPP, sourcing is scattered globally. However, the priority for engagement is for high and medium risk areas. There's quite limited data available and not yet a sectorally available framework or assessment which defines thresholds for no to insignificant risk. And therefore, generally, the PPP DCF methodology uses terminology that talks about low risk countries as an interim approach in acknowledgement that the pulp and paper sector may develop a sectoral approach. This is considered to be an adequate approach because of the strong controls that many countries have. And it's important to know that this low risk definition should be considering both deforestation, conversion, and degradation over time. In terms of reporting, it's key that companies aim to achieve transparency so that there's a disaggregation within the DCF reporting, which shows the percentage of volumes which are coming from low risk countries. In terms of some of the publicly available resources, you can see some resources available from Forest Trends that look at timber trade data. There's also the Earthworm Foundation's Country Priority Matrix, the CPM, which also can be used in terms of informing approach that company might use regarding country prioritization. And risk categories are included for deforestation, degradation, legality, land rights, and labour rights. In terms of the kind of information that an FBC company may request from the supplier, again, it's likely that this information is to be collected through the self-reporting form, and particularly this subcomponent on accessing information on percentage from different countries of harvest. A buyer might also request an independent audit to be able to review a supplier's internal system and verify the traceability data. And it's important to note that where there isn't traceability information yet available, a buyer might engage their supplier to support them in gaining further visibility on traceability and being able to achieve country of harvest eventually. Moving on to options C and D, remote and field assessment. Remote assessment of production areas is generally not a commonly used implementation option in the context of pulp and paper. Field assessment of production areas is also not commonly used, but might form part of a certification or auditing process, particularly where there is a grievance associated with specific suppliers or key volumes, in which case an upstream or a downstream company may consider implementing this option. Regarding the kind of information that might be requested here, this is likely to be requested through a self-reporting form, but at this point, a company may be aiming to achieve and access information beyond country of harvest, so going to subnational data, particularly for countries with medium or high priority. A buyer may also request transparency of the system that a supplier is using and their assurance mechanisms, including understanding how frequently a supplier monitors an area, the level of granularity that they use, and also their response system to a deforestation event. Finally, moving on to supplier DCF control, so option E. This relates to a context where a downstream supply chain actor, so a FBC member, might have quite limited access to robust traceability information. However, it's important to note that in the context of PPP, this is not a commonly used action or implementation option because of the focus and reliance on certification primarily. So we've walked through implementations A, B, C, and D. Implementation option E is where a buyer is checking that their supplier effectively implements implementation options A to D, or a combination of all of these, to effectively manage deforestation-related risks, and has a way of checking this methodology. Once a buyer has confirmed that the supplier's DCF control system is aligned, the buyer can then consider the volumes that are DCF and the volumes that are not DCF from that supplier. And here, again, this information is likely to be requested through a self-reporting form, but a buyer might also request transparency of the implementation options that a supplier uses and the methodology and assurance systems that they have in place. In particular, now we're going to explore how this might work in a context of a supplier who sources PEFC or SFI volumes. So as we know, currently PEFC and SFI alone don't fully yet address DCF, and so it's likely that additional information might be requested from a supplier to demonstrate that they're doing complementary actions to support delivering on DCF. Some of the kinds of additional information that might get requested from a supplier might include more granular traceability data. So, for example, for SFI, where we're talking about volumes from US and Canada, a buyer might request more subnational data to define which regions within these countries and be able to identify whether there's an associated risk in those subnational areas in the context of deforestation and conversion. For PEFC, a buyer might seek to understand which nationally endorsed scheme the volume was certified under, and from that be able to determine if the national scheme fully implements the DCF criteria and definitions in alignment with AFI. A buyer might also request to see a supplier's deforestation-free procurement policy and also the implementation processes that they have in place associated with this. It's important to note then the kinds of actions that a company could take for the volumes that don't fall into that DCF category, so those that are non-DCF. First, there's actions that a company might take with their supplier and within their supply chain to effectively manage deforestation risk, and where currently there isn't a DCF option available. It's important that a company is engaging to collaborate and try and mitigate those risks associated with their supply chain. There's also actions that companies can take beyond their supply chains and beyond working with their suppliers. For example, working in production landscapes to collaborate and transform PPP production. And this is a key component of the Forest Positive Coalition Theory of Change under Element 4, which covers landscapes and is part of the strategy. Below, you can also see here the kinds of review cycles that a company might take to understand where they're prioritizing efforts in delivering on their no deforestation commitments that they might have, and how this also links to the supplier engagement that they might do. Finally, we'd like to point you to some available resources in the context of pulp and paper. There's the FBC roadmap, and there's also roadmap guidance, which is where the DCF methodology also sits.